It is not that things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that things are difficult. Seneca. What if I told you that most modern marriages don't fail because of a lack of love, attraction, or effort, but because the rules of marriage itself have quietly changed, and almost no man was warned in advance? What if the version of marriage you were sold, partnership, loyalty, shared sacrifice, no longer exists in the form your father or grandfather knew? And what if walking into it blindly today carries risks that society never talks about, but expects you to absorb in silence? Everywhere you look, divorce rates are climbing, commitment is weakening, and men are being told to just do better, while the institution itself is eroding from the inside. This isn't about hating women. It's about understanding incentives, power shifts, and cultural conditioning, and how ignoring them can cost you your peace, your purpose, and your future. In this video, we're going to strip emotion from the discussion and examine marriage through a calm, stoic lens. Facts over feelings, clarity over comfort. Watch till the very end, because the final insight may change how you view relationships, commitment, and your role as a man forever. Number 1, marriage shifted from duty and commitment to personal happiness and emotional fulfillment. There's a deeper shift beneath the noise, and if you don't look at it clearly, you'll miss what's actually happening. Marriage didn't collapse overnight. It drifted, slowly, quietly, almost politely. What once stood on duty, endurance, and shared responsibility has been redefined around personal happiness and emotional fulfillment. And when happiness becomes the primary metric, commitment quietly becomes conditional. Stoicism saw this danger long ago. Warned, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. When marriage is estimated as a tool for constant emotional satisfaction, it is set up to fail the moment life becomes uncomfortable, which it always does. You live in a culture that teaches you to ask, "Am I happy?" far more often than, "Am I honorable?" or "Am I steady?" That question seems harmless, even healthy, until it becomes the only standard by which lifelong commitments are judged. Stoicism never dismissed emotion, but it never allowed emotion to lead. Seneca wrote, "He who lives in harmony with himself lives in harmony with the universe." Harmony comes from character, not from chasing feelings. When marriage is expected to constantly validate, excite, and emotionally fulfill, it stops being a discipline and turns into a demand. This shift didn't just change expectations, it changed tolerance. When happiness is framed as a right rather than a byproduct of virtue, endurance starts to feel like oppression. Patience feels like settling. Duty feels outdated. And the idea of staying through emotional droughts feels unreasonable. But Stoicism teaches you something modern culture avoids. Discomfort is not a sign of failure. It's a condition of growth. Epictetus was blunt. First say to yourself what you would be, then do what you have to do. Marriage, when rooted in duty, asks you to become something stronger than your moods. When rooted in emotional fulfillment, it asks the opposite. It asks the relationship to serve you endlessly. You can feel the tension here. Emotional fulfillment is unpredictable. It rises and falls. It responds to stress, novelty, fatigue, and time. Duty, on the other hand, is stable. It doesn't ask how you feel today. It asks who you decided to be. When marriage shifts away from duty, it becomes vulnerable to every emotional fluctuation. Stoicism doesn't deny emotion, it trains you not to obey it blindly. Reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. A marriage anchored in duty assumes both partners will govern themselves first. A marriage anchored in happiness quietly assumes the opposite. This is where the problem compounds. When emotional fulfillment becomes the goal, disappointment feels personal rather than situational. Every unmet expectation starts to feel like betrayal. And instead of asking, "What am I responsible for maintaining?" The question becomes, why am I not being fulfilled? Stoicism reverses this lens. Seneca advised, demand much of yourself and expect little from others. That mindset builds resilience. The modern framing builds fragility. One prepares you to carry weight. The other prepares you to abandon it when it becomes heavy. You're not meant to hear this as an attack. You're meant to hear it as a warning. Marriage cannot survive if both people enter it primarily to be fulfilled rather than to contribute. Emotional fulfillment is a result, not a foundation. When it becomes the foundation, every season of silence, stress, or stagnation feels like proof something is broken. Stoicism teaches you that seasons are not verdicts, they are tests. Wrote, the universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. Change is inevitable. Stability must be chosen. If you want to protect yourself from this trap, you have to retrain how you think about commitment. Start with this exercise. Write down what you believe marriage owes you. Then write down what you believe you owe marriage. Compare the lists honestly. Stoicism demands this kind of self-examination. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." If your expectations outweigh your obligations, dissatisfaction is guaranteed. Not because marriage failed, but because the frame was wrong from the start. Another practice is emotional discipline. This doesn't mean suppressing feelings. It means not letting them dictate permanent decisions. Each day, ask yourself, did I act today based on principle or based on mood? That single question reveals more than any argument ever could. Seneca believed daily reflection was essential to character, not to judge yourself harshly, but to correct course before drift becomes damage. The truth is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. A marriage built on duty can survive periods without happiness. A marriage built on happiness rarely survives periods without excitement. Stoicism sides with endurance, not because it is cold, but because it is honest about human nature. Feelings change, commitments hold. And when commitments hold long enough, fulfillment often returns, deeper, quieter, and more real than before. If you want something that lasts, you must choose something harder than chasing how you feel. You must choose who you are when feelings fade. That is the Stoic path. Not resentment, not blame, responsibility, discipline, and the courage to build something that doesn't collapse the moment it stops entertaining you. Number 2, unrealistic expectations, fueled by social media and romanticized narratives. There's a tension you can feel but rarely see named clearly. Marriage is collapsing under the weight of expectations that were never meant to be carried by real people. And a large part of that weight comes from images, narratives, and fantasies that reward emotion over reality. Stoicism cuts through this illusion with uncomfortable honesty. Warned, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. When expectations are shaped by screens instead of substance, by performance instead of principle, disappointment becomes inevitable. Not because marriage is broken, but because the standard being chased was never human to begin with. You live in a time where romance is constantly edited, filtered, dramatized, and monetized. Love is no longer presented as something built through patience, sacrifice, and discipline. It's sold as a feeling that should never fade, a spark that should never dim, a partner who should always intuit, provide, excite, and validate. When those expectations settle into the mind, they don't arrive quietly. They arrive with entitlement, with comparison, with the silent belief that if something feels difficult, it must be wrong. Stoicism stands in direct opposition to this softness. Epictetus said it plainly. Do not seek for things to happen the way you want them to. Rather, wish that what happens happen the way it happens. Unrealistic expectations don't just distort relationships, they erode respect. When marriage is viewed through romanticized narratives, effort becomes invisible. Commitment becomes conditional. The ordinary rhythms of life feel like failure instead of stability. You start measuring your relationship against fantasies instead of values. And once that happens, dissatisfaction grows even when nothing is truly wrong. Stoicism teaches that peace comes not from getting what you want, but from wanting what aligns with reason. Marriage was never meant to be a constant emotional high. It was meant to be a shared discipline, a partnership of endurance, a structure strong enough to hold two flawed people as they grow. What social media does so effectively is train the mind to expect novelty without responsibility. It rewards the dramatic moment, not the quiet consistency. It glorifies attention, not loyalty. Over time, this rewires desire. You begin to crave stimulation over depth, affirmation over effort. Seneca warned, "He who is everywhere is nowhere." When attention is scattered across endless romantic ideals, no single bond is ever allowed to deepen properly. Marriage suffers not because it lacks love, but because it's being compared to illusions that never had to survive real life. You may notice how quickly dissatisfaction is framed as empowerment, how walking away is celebrated more than working through, how patience is portrayed as settling. Stoicism challenges this narrative aggressively, reminded himself, the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. When thoughts are fed by curated fantasies, happiness becomes fragile. Marriage then becomes a performance review instead of a moral commitment. And once commitment is treated like a mood, it collapses the moment feelings fluctuate. This isn't about suppressing desire or denying emotion. Stoicism never asked for numbness. It asked for order, for reason to lead emotion instead of chasing it. Unrealistic expectations flourish when emotion is treated as authority, when I feel becomes more important than I chose. Marriage, at its core, is a choice repeated daily, especially when it's inconvenient. Social media narratives rarely show that repetition. They sell endings, not endurance, and endurance is where character is formed. If you want to counter this influence, you must train your mind deliberately. Start with expectation audits. Write down what you believe marriage should feel like at all times. Then ask yourself one brutal question. Is this expectation rooted in virtue or fantasy? Stoicism demands that you separate what is within your control from what is not. You cannot control constant excitement. You cannot control perpetual emotional intensity. But you can control your commitment, your conduct, your effort. Epictetus said, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." Another practice is narrative fasting. Reduce how much romanticized content you consume, even temporarily. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. Give your mind space to recalibrate. Notice how your emotional baseline shifts when you're no longer comparing your private life to public performances. This isn't withdrawal, it's detox. Seneca advised simplicity for this very reason. It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor. Excessive romantic expectation creates emotional poverty, not fulfillment. You also need to reframe effort. Effort is not evidence that something is wrong. Effort is evidence that something matters. Stoicism honors effort because it builds virtue. When marriage becomes difficult, that difficulty is not an alarm bell, it's a training ground. Viewed obstacles as teachers, not threats. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The same applies here. The friction you resist is often the friction that matures you. If you want a grounded exercise, do this weekly. Write one page on what marriage requires of you, not what it owes you. Focus only on your discipline, your patience, your restraint, your honesty. This shifts your orientation from consumption to contribution. Over time, unrealistic expectations lose their grip because your identity is no longer built around being satisfied, but being solid. Marriage was never designed to compete with fantasy. It was designed to build legacy, stability, and character. When expectations are fueled by romanticized narratives, marriage is asked to entertain instead of endure. That's an impossible standard. Stoicism restores sanity by reminding you that meaning comes from alignment with reason, not emotional spectacle. Seneca put it best: "A man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." Expectation-driven disappointment is exactly that: unnecessary suffering. So if you want marriage to survive, your habits must change. Your consumption must change. Your definitions must change. Replace fantasy with discipline. Replace comparison with commitment. Replace emotional addiction with moral clarity. When you do, marriage stops feeling like a burden and starts feeling like what it was always meant to be: a shared path that strengthens you precisely because it isn't perfect. Number 3. Prioritizing independence over cooperation and long-term compromise. There's a tension at the heart of modern marriage that few want to name out loud. Independence has been elevated into a virtue so absolute that cooperation now feels like a threat. Compromise is framed as weakness. Long-term thinking is quietly replaced with short-term self-protection. And when this mindset enters marriage, the structure doesn't crack all at once. It erodes from the inside. Stoicism offers a lens that cuts through the noise. Wrote, "What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee." Marriage, by its nature, is a hive. When independence becomes more important than shared direction, the system cannot hold. You've been taught to admire autonomy, self-sufficiency, and personal freedom above all else. On their own, these qualities aren't destructive. Stoicism never argued against strength or self-command. In fact, Epictetus insisted that mastery of the self is the foundation of a good life. But the problem begins when independence stops being a tool and becomes an identity. When cooperation is seen as limitation instead of leverage. Marriage doesn't ask you to disappear. It asks you to align. And alignment requires surrender, not of dignity but of ego. The Stoics understood that human beings are not designed to live as isolated units. Reminded himself daily, human beings are made for each other. Marriage is not a contract of convenience. It is a long game of shared responsibility. When independence is prioritized above cooperation, every disagreement becomes a boundary dispute. Every inconvenience feels like a violation. Every sacrifice feels like loss. Over time, this mindset trains you to protect yourself from your partner instead of building with them. What quietly undermines marriage is not conflict, it's refusal. Refusal to bend, refusal to negotiate, refusal to carry weight that doesn't immediately benefit you. Stoicism teaches endurance, not entitlement. Seneca warned, "He who lives only for himself lives a very small life." Marriage demands a larger frame. It requires you to think in decades, not moods, in seasons, not moments. When independence becomes the highest value, long-term compromise feels intolerable because it asks you to delay gratification, restrain impulses, and place something above immediate self-interest. You may notice how easily modern language turns cooperation into oppression. Words like settling, losing yourself, or being controlled replace older ideas of duty, loyalty, and shared sacrifice. Stoicism cuts through that distortion by asking a simple question: does this choice strengthen your character or weaken it? Compromise, when chosen deliberately, strengthens discipline. Cooperation builds patience. Long-term thinking sharpens wisdom. These are not losses. They are virtues earned through friction. Epictetus taught, "Don't seek for things to happen as you wish, but wish for things to happen as they do, and you will go on well." Marriage operates on this principle. You do not get to engineer a partner who never disrupts your preferences. You are invited to grow through difference. When independence dominates, growth is replaced by exit strategies. The mind stays half-packed. Commitment becomes conditional. And once that mindset takes root, the bond weakens, not because of betrayal, but because of emotional distance disguised as self-respect. Long-term compromise isn't about losing power. It's about distributing it wisely. Two people moving in slightly adjusted directions can cover more ground than one person sprinting alone. Stoicism emphasizes reason over impulse. Ask yourself honestly, is your resistance to cooperation rooted in clarity or in fear of vulnerability? Independence can be a shield. It can also be a wall. The Stoics didn't confuse emotional avoidance with strength. They trained themselves to face discomfort without fleeing it. Here, where responsibility enters. Marriage doesn't fail because one person wants autonomy. It falters when autonomy refuses to coexist with accountability. Wrote, if you can benefit the community, you benefit yourself. In marriage, the community is the union itself. Decisions made purely for personal comfort slowly starve the relationship, not dramatically, quietly, until resentment replaces trust and parallel lives replace partnership. Stoicism invites you to practice voluntary restraint, to choose discipline over indulgence, to act according to principle rather than impulse. These skills are essential in marriage. Long-term compromise requires you to say no to yourself regularly, not because you are lesser, but because the bond is greater. When independence is prioritized above this, marriage becomes a negotiation between two individuals instead of a shared mission. To recalibrate, you must train your thinking. Begin with this exercise. Each morning, remind yourself that cooperation is not submission. Write one sentence. Today, I will act in a way that strengthens the union, not just myself. Let that guide small decisions. Another practice is delayed judgment. When resistance rises, pause, breathe. Ask, is this about principle or preference? Stoicism teaches you to distinguish what truly matters from what merely irritates. You can also practice long-range vision. Once a week, reflect on the kind of life you are building, not next month, but in 20 years. Seneca advised, let us think of life as a whole. Independence that ignores the future is not freedom, it's short-sightedness. Cooperation, when guided by reason, is an investment. Compromise, when chosen consciously, compounds over time. Marriage doesn't collapse because people want strength. It collapses when strength refuses to share space. Stoicism does not glorify selfishness dressed up as empowerment. It honors balance, duty, mutual reliance. The courage to stay engaged when walking away would be easier. When independence overshadows cooperation, marriage stops being a discipline and becomes a convenience. And conveniences are discarded when they demand effort. You are not asked to abandon yourself. You are asked to master yourself, to choose character over comfort, to understand that freedom without responsibility is fragile and intimacy without compromise is impossible. Said, the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. In marriage, the best protection is to be unlike the culture that teaches you to put yourself first at all costs. So slow down. Relearn cooperation as a strength. Train compromise as a skill, not a surrender. Think long. Act deliberately. Marriage survives not on passion alone, but on disciplined partnership. And discipline, as the Stoics knew well, is not a cage. It's the structure that makes freedom sustainable. Number 4, loss of respect for traditional marital roles and responsibilities. There's a tension you can feel beneath the surface of modern marriage, and it isn't loud at first. It shows up quietly, through confusion about roles, reluctance toward responsibility, and a subtle erosion of respect for structure itself. Stoicism teaches you to look past emotion and examine causes. Wrote, the universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. When the shared understanding of marital roles dissolves, marriage doesn't collapse overnight. It slowly loses its spine. What you're witnessing isn't rebellion against tradition for growth's sake, but confusion dressed up as progress, and confusion always carries a cost. Traditional marital roles were never about dominance or submission. They were about order, about clarity, about two people knowing where they stand and what is expected of them so energy could be directed toward building, not negotiating endlessly. When respect for those roles disappears, marriage turns into a negotiation without end. You feel it when accountability is avoided but authority is demanded, when benefits are desired but burdens are resented. Stoicism reminds you that harmony comes from alignment with nature, not from pretending structure is oppression. Epictetus said, "First learn the meaning of what you say and then speak." The same applies to commitment. If roles are rejected without understanding their purpose, marriage becomes a vague idea rather than a disciplined practice. You're encouraged today to believe that roles limit freedom, but freedom without responsibility is not freedom, it's drift. Traditional roles anchored marriage by assigning duties that balanced each other. When that respect erodes, resentment grows quietly. Expectations become selective. Responsibility becomes optional. And respect fades not because of cruelty, but because inconsistency erodes trust. Stoicism teaches that respect is earned through conduct, not demanded through ideology. Seneca warned, "He who is brave is free." Courage in marriage looks like embracing responsibility even when culture encourages avoidance. What often goes unspoken is that rejecting roles doesn't eliminate them, it just makes them invisible and contested. Someone still carries the weight, someone still sacrifices, someone still leads when decisions must be made. When respect for structure is lost, power struggles replace cooperation, not because people are evil, but because nature abhors a vacuum. Stoicism insists that order is not tyranny, it is stability. Reminded himself, what brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee. Marriage is a hive. Roles exist to protect the whole, not to elevate one ego over another. You may notice how easily respect dissolves when responsibility is mocked or dismissed, when duty is framed as weakness, when commitment is treated as negotiable depending on mood. Stoicism cuts through that fog and asks a harder question. Are you living in accordance with your role or running from it? Respect cannot survive where obligations are treated as optional, and marriage cannot thrive when roles are constantly renegotiated based on feelings rather than principles. This doesn't mean stagnation. Stoicism is not nostalgia, it's realism. Roles can adapt, but they cannot vanish without consequence. When respect for them disappears entirely, marriage becomes a contest of wills instead of a union of purpose. Epictetus taught, if you want something good, get it from yourself. Applied here, it means discipline must precede demands. If respect is desired, it must be modeled through consistency, accountability, and restraint, not through slogans, not through entitlement. You're living in a time where responsibility is often reframed as burden, and tradition is caricatured as outdated without being examined. But Stoicism teaches you to test ideas by their outcomes, not their popularity. Ask yourself, does abandoning structure produce stronger unions or more fragile ones? Does rejecting roles create peace or constant friction? Wisdom requires the courage to answer honestly, even when the answer isn't fashionable. Now comes the part where you take responsibility for your own alignment. You can't control cultural tides, but you can control the standards you live by. One practical exercise is role clarity reflection. Sit quietly and write what you believe marriage requires to function well, not what feels good, but what endures pressure. Write the responsibilities that must be carried consistently for trust to exist. This isn't about blame, it's about clarity. Wrote, if it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. Apply that to expectations. Strip away confusion. Keep only what is necessary. Another exercise is discipline before dialogue. Before discussing expectations or frustrations, ask yourself whether you are fully living up to your own duties. Stoicism demands self-scrutiny first. Seneca advised, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." Wasted effort in marriage often comes from trying to change the other person before mastering your own conduct. Respect grows where self-mastery is visible. You're not meant to fight modernity blindly, nor surrender to it passively. You're meant to stand rooted. Traditional marital roles existed to channel human nature, not suppress it. When respect for that wisdom erodes, marriage loses its orientation. And without orientation, even love becomes unstable. Stoicism reminds you that endurance is built on structure, not impulse. So take this moment seriously, not with anger, not with bitterness, with resolve. Decide what kind of marriage you believe is worth preserving. Decide what responsibilities you will honor regardless of trends. Decide to act with discipline when others act with confusion. Wrote, "Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself." That single line can rebuild more than arguments ever will. Marriage does not survive on feelings alone. It survives on order, respect, and shared responsibility. When respect for roles disappears, so does the glue that holds everything together. If you want something stronger, live in a way that supports it. Structure your conduct, respect duty, choose discipline over drift. And remember, tradition wasn't built by accident. It was forged by centuries of hard lessons. Ignoring those lessons doesn't make you free, it makes you fragile. Number 5, constant comparison to other couples, creating chronic dissatisfaction. Constant comparison is a quiet, corrosive force. It doesn't arrive loudly or announce its intentions. It slips in as a habit of measurement, a reflex of scanning, a subtle itch that asks, "Is this enough?" And over time, that question reshapes how you experience marriage. Stoicism warned about this long before algorithms learned to monetize envy. Wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." The moment's satisfaction depends on how your relationship stacks up against others. Your peace is no longer yours. It's outsourced. And once comparison becomes constant, dissatisfaction becomes chronic. You're not comparing to reality. You're comparing to curated illusions, selective highlights, idealized narratives. Even when the mind knows this intellectually, the emotional body still reacts. Comparison trains you to overlook what is stable, loyal, and quietly meaningful, and instead fixate on what appears more exciting, more expressive, more validating elsewhere. Stoicism calls this a failure of judgment, not circumstance. Epictetus was blunt. If you admire something external, you make yourself its slave. When marriage becomes evaluated through external benchmarks, it stops being a practice of commitment and becomes a scoreboard. And scoreboards always produce anxiety. The deeper issue isn't comparison itself, but what it does to desire. It fragments it. Instead of wanting to build depth, you begin wanting options. Instead of cultivating appreciation, you begin scanning for upgrades. That shift poisons intimacy because intimacy requires presence, not perpetual evaluation. The Stoics emphasized attention as a moral act. Where you direct your focus determines your character. Reminded himself, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. A mind trained on comparison will inevitably tint marriage with dissatisfaction, no matter how much stability exists. Comparison also creates a false sense of entitlement. When you constantly observe other couples and measure against them, you unconsciously assume that happiness is something owed to you in a particular shape. If your marriage doesn't match that imagined standard, resentment begins to ferment. Stoicism rejects this mindset entirely. Seneca wrote, "He who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." Chronic dissatisfaction is often suffering borrowed from imagined alternatives, not from actual deprivation. The marriage isn't failing. The perception is restless. What makes this especially destructive is that comparison never ends. There is no finish line. There will always be something newer, louder, more impressive, more romanticized. If satisfaction depends on relative ranking, you're signing up for lifelong discontent. Stoicism offers a different axis: internal alignment. Is the relationship fostering virtue? Is it cultivating patience, loyalty, restraint, honesty? Those are Stoic measures of success, and they don't fluctuate with trends or external validation. When you abandon those measures, marriage turns into a performance rather than a discipline. You must understand this clearly. Dissatisfaction fueled by comparison is not accidental, it is trained. Every time you entertain the thought that something elsewhere would be better, you reinforce the habit. Epictetus taught that freedom begins with governing impressions. You don't control what appears in your mind, but you control what you agree with. When the impulse to compare arises, that is your moment of choice. You either feed it or starve it. One path leads to gratitude, the other leads to erosion. Stoicism doesn't ask you to suppress desire. It asks you to refine it, to desire what is worthy of desire. Wrote, "Do not indulge in dreams of having what you have not, but reckon the chief of the blessings you do possess." Chronic comparison does the opposite. It trains you to mentally live elsewhere while physically remaining where you are. That split creates emotional absence. Over time, that absence feels like emptiness. And emptiness gets mislabeled as unhappiness with marriage, when it is actually disconnection from the present. There's also a subtle disrespect embedded in constant comparison. It treats commitment as provisional, conditional on outperforming imagined alternatives. Stoicism places honor in steadfastness. Seneca argued that loyalty to chosen duties is the foundation of a stable life. When marriage becomes subject to endless comparison, it loses its sacredness. It becomes a consumer choice rather than a vow. And consumer logic is brutal. It always promises more and delivers less. To reverse this pattern, you need to retrain attention, not through force but through discipline. One practical exercise is deliberate sufficiency. Each day, intentionally name what is already enough. Not what could be improved, not what is missing, what is sufficient. This conditions the mind away from scarcity. Another exercise is impression fasting. When comparison thoughts arise, do not argue with them. Simply label them. This is comparison, not truth. Then return your attention to what is directly in front of you. Epictetus emphasized this skill relentlessly, separating impressions from judgments. You can also practice Stoic contrast, but inwardly. Instead of comparing outward to others, compare your present self to your former self. Ask whether your conduct today reflects greater patience, fairness, and self-control than before. This redirects ambition toward character, not optics. Urged himself, be satisfied with even the smallest progress and treat the result of it as no small matter. Satisfaction grows when progress is measured internally. Marriage cannot survive in a mind addicted to alternatives. It thrives in a mind committed to cultivation. Constant comparison turns partners into competitors with fantasies. Stoicism turns marriage into a training ground for virtue. One produces dissatisfaction, the other produces steadiness. The difference is not luck, it is practice. So act deliberately. Audit your mental habits. Remove the quiet comparisons you've normalized. Replace them with conscious appreciation and chosen loyalty. Not because it's easy, but because it's stabilizing. Chronic dissatisfaction isn't solved by finding something better. It's dissolved by learning to value what you've already chosen. And when you do that, comparison loses its grip and marriage regains its center, not as a spectacle, but as a disciplined, enduring bond. Number 6, confusing empowerment with avoidance of accountability. There's a subtle confusion shaping modern relationships, and it's doing quiet damage to marriage. Empowerment has been redefined as freedom from accountability rather than mastery of responsibility. At first glance, that sounds like strength, independence, self-assertion. But Stoicism asks you to look deeper past the slogans and emotions into the long-term consequences of how ideas are lived, not how they sound. Warned, if it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. Empowerment that dissolves accountability may feel liberating in the moment, but it slowly corrodes trust, stability, and the very structure that makes marriage endure. You live in a time where personal fulfillment is often framed as the highest good. If something feels restrictive, uncomfortable, or demanding, it's labeled oppressive. Commitment becomes negotiable. Responsibility is recast as limitation. But marriage, by its nature, is not built on endless self-expression. It is built on self-governance, on the willingness to be answerable for choices, emotions, and promises, especially when doing so is inconvenient. Stoicism never taught escape from duty. It taught elevation through it. Epictetus said, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control." Accountability is not the enemy of freedom, it is the condition for it. When empowerment is stripped of accountability, it becomes fragile. It depends on validation, external approval, and the ability to exit whenever friction appears. Marriage, however, exposes friction by design. It reveals character under pressure. It asks you to regulate emotion rather than obey it, to repair rather than replace, to reflect rather than react. Avoidance dressed up as empowerment teaches the opposite habit. It trains you to walk away instead of work through, to justify instead of examine, to protect ego instead of integrity. Over time, that mindset doesn't just weaken marriage, it weakens the self. Stoicism is relentless on this point. You are responsible not for what you feel, but for what you do with what you feel. Reminded himself daily, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Accountability begins there. Not in blaming structures, expectations, or partners, but in owning reactions, choices, and patterns. Marriage collapses when accountability is outsourced, when responsibility is always external, and introspection is treated as optional. This confusion also distorts the meaning of equality. Equality does not mean symmetry of desire without symmetry of duty. It does not mean autonomy without obligation. True equality in marriage is mutual accountability, two people willing to hold themselves to standards even when no one is forcing them to. Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free." Courage in marriage looks like staying present when it would be easier to disengage, like admitting fault without theatrics, like choosing repair over righteous exit. You don't need louder voices or sharper defenses. You need clarity. Empowerment that cannot coexist with accountability is not empowerment at all, it is avoidance with better branding. And avoidance always charges interest. It shows up later as instability, resentment, and fractured trust. Marriage requires delayed gratification, emotional regulation, and the humility to be wrong. These are Stoic virtues, not outdated constraints. They are the architecture of endurance. If you want to build something that lasts, you must retrain how you interpret discomfort. Discomfort is not a signal to escape. It is information. It tells you where growth is required. Stoicism teaches you to sit with that signal, not silence it. Epictetus advised, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. Accountability is embodiment. It is choosing disciplined response over impulsive justification, again and again. Here is a simple but demanding exercise. Write down, privately and honestly, the moments where your first instinct is deflection rather than reflection. Not to shame yourself, but to see your habits clearly. Then ask one question: what part of this is within my control? Not what someone else did, not what society says, just you. Repeat this daily. Over time, accountability stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like power. Another practice, emotional ownership. When strong emotion arises, pause before acting. Name the emotion silently. Breathe. Then decide your response based on your values, not your impulse. Practice this relentlessly. This discipline is not suppression, it is leadership of the self first. Marriage cannot survive without self-leadership. You are not losing power by being accountable. You are consolidating it. The ability to stay, to work, to repair, to be answerable. This is rare strength in an age that celebrates exit. Stoicism does not promise ease. It promises clarity. And clarity reveals that marriage is not ruined by responsibility, but by its absence. If empowerment is real, it should make you more capable of commitment, not less. More reliable, not more elusive. More grounded, not perpetually self-protective. Anything else is a misunderstanding that feels good briefly and costs dearly over time. Seneca said, "No person has the power to have everything they want, but it is in their power not to want what they don't have." Marriage demands that kind of maturity, the discipline to choose depth over endless options. So act differently. Choose accountability as a daily practice, not a threat. Let empowerment mean mastery of self, not escape from responsibility. Marriage does not need perfection. It needs people strong enough to be answerable for who they are becoming. And that strength, cultivated calmly and consistently, is what keeps foundations from cracking when pressure inevitably arrives. Number 7. Emotional decision-making, overriding patience and long-term thinking. There's a pattern you need to look at calmly, without anger, without bitterness, and without pretending it doesn't exist. When emotional decision-making overrides patience and long-term thinking, marriage stops being a covenant and turns into a reaction. Stoicism has always warned against this. Wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." When emotions are allowed to steer permanent decisions, that power is surrendered. And no long-term institution can survive being governed by momentary feelings. You've been taught, directly and indirectly, that emotions are always valid, that if something feels heavy or uncomfortable, it must be escaped. But feelings are weather, not truth. They shift. They intensify. They pass. Marriage, on the other hand, is built on endurance, restraint, and the ability to think beyond the present moment. When impatience replaces perspective, commitment starts to feel like a burden instead of a responsibility. And when short-term emotional relief becomes the goal, long-term stability quietly collapses. Stoicism never emotion. It emotions right to rule. Epictetus made this distinction clear. Do not let the force of the impression carry you away. Emotional impulses are impressions. They are not commands. Yet modern conditioning encourages acting first and rationalizing later. When frustration, dissatisfaction, or restlessness appears, the reflex is often immediate action instead of reflection. Decisions that should be filtered through time, reason, and consequence are rushed through the narrow gate of feeling. Marriage cannot survive that compression. You need to understand something crucial here. Emotional decision-making isn't strength. It's not authenticity, it's reactivity. And reactivity is the opposite of maturity. Patience requires discipline. Long-term thinking requires humility. Both demand that you tolerate discomfort without escaping it. Seneca warned, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." When patience is abandoned, growth is abandoned with it. What's especially destructive is the belief that happiness must be constant. And if it isn't, something must be wrong with the structure rather than the mindset. Marriage was never meant to be an uninterrupted emotional high. It's a framework for building character, stability, and shared purpose over time. When emotions are treated as final judges instead of passing signals, dissatisfaction is mistaken for failure. And instead of slowing down to examine oneself, the impulse is to exit. Stoicism asks you to pause before you act, especially when emotions are loud. Practice this relentlessly. He reminded himself, calm is the cradle of power. Calm allows you to see beyond the present feeling. It stretches your perception forward. into consequences you don't yet feel but will eventually live with. Emotional decision-making shrinks your vision. It locks you into now. And marriage demands a future-oriented mind. This doesn't mean suppressing emotion. It means subordinating it to reason. Feelings are information, not instruction. They tell you something is happening internally, not what must be done externally. When patience disappears, emotional spikes start dictating permanent outcomes. That's when vows become conditional and commitment becomes negotiable. Over time, this erodes trust, not just between partners but within oneself. Here, where responsibility enters. Stoicism places responsibility squarely on the individual. You are accountable for how you interpret, regulate, and act on emotion. You don't get to outsource that responsibility to circumstances. Epictetus said, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." If you believe every emotion deserves immediate action, there's nothing left to learn, only damage to manage. To counter this, you need to train patience like a muscle. Start with delayed response. When emotion rises, do nothing immediately. Not because you're avoiding, but because you're choosing clarity. Give yourself space. Let the feeling run its course without attaching a decision to it. Most emotions peak and fade if you don't feed them with action. This alone rewires your relationship with impulse. Another practice is future anchoring. When you feel driven to act emotionally, ask yourself one question: will this decision still make sense to me in 5 years? Not in 5 days. Not after the emotion settles. 5 years. Constantly pulled his mind forward in time to escape the tyranny of the moment. This habit alone restores perspective. You should also practice emotional labeling without identification. Say to yourself, "I am experiencing frustration," not "I am frustrated." This subtle shift creates distance. You stop becoming the emotion and start observing it. Seneca wrote, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality." Observation dissolves exaggeration, and exaggeration is what drives reckless decisions. Marriage requires long-range thinking because it's not built for convenience. It's built for continuity. When emotional comfort becomes the highest value, sacrifice feels unjust, patience feels pointless, and endurance feels outdated. But Stoicism teaches you that endurance is not suffering. It's sovereignty. It's the ability to remain steady while everything inside you urges movement. This isn't about blame. It's about patterns. And patterns only change when awareness replaces impulse. If emotions are always obeyed, they will eventually demand more than they give. But when emotions are respected without being, they become manageable, useful even. So here's your challenge. For the next 30 days, commit to one rule: no major decisions made under emotional intensity. None. Write it down. Hold yourself to it. During that time, journal daily about what you feel without acting on it. Let patience stretch your nervous system. Let time do what emotion cannot clarify. Said, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injustice." You could reframe that. The best protection is to be unlike the impulse that tries to rule you. Emotional decision-making may feel powerful in the moment, but it leaves ruins behind. Patience builds quietly. Long-term thinking compounds, and marriage, if it is to survive, demands both. Calm yourself. Slow down. Choose reason over reaction, not because emotion is evil, but because discipline is necessary. The future rewards those who can endure the present without destroying what they once promised to protect. Number 8, reduce tolerance for hardship, boredom, and routine phases of marriage. There's a quiet shift happening that most people don't want to name out loud, and it revolves around tolerance. Not tolerance for opinions or preferences, but tolerance for hardship, boredom, and routine, the very phases that marriage inevitably moves through. When that tolerance erodes, commitment starts to feel optional instead of sacred. The Stoics understood something modern culture keeps trying to escape. A meaningful life is not a constant stream of stimulation. Wrote, ask yourself at every moment, is this necessary? Marriage demands that same question, not when things are exciting, but when they are ordinary, repetitive, and unglamorous. You've been conditioned to expect perpetual emotional highs, constant novelty, endless validation. When marriage settles into rhythm, many interpret that rhythm as failure instead of stability. Reduced tolerance for discomfort makes routine feel like a threat. But routine is not decay, it's structure. It's the ground where trust, loyalty, and shared purpose quietly grow. The Stoics didn't seek excitement, they sought steadiness. Seneca warned, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity." For he is not permitted to prove himself. Marriage is one of the few institutions that still asks you to prove yourself through endurance rather than escape. Hardship is not a flaw in marriage, it's a feature. It exposes character. When tolerance is low, even mild difficulty feels unbearable. Small frustrations start to feel like existential problems. Boredom gets misread as incompatibility. Routine gets labeled as stagnation. But Stoicism teaches you that your reactions reveal more than the situation itself. Epictetus said, "It is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." When tolerance disappears, reaction replaces responsibility. Instead of asking how to grow through a phase, the instinct becomes how to exit it. You live in a culture that glorifies feelings over principles. When feelings dip, commitment is questioned. But feelings were never meant to carry the weight of a lifelong bond. They fluctuate, they fatigue, they repeat themselves, principles endure. The Stoics built their lives around this idea, reminded himself daily, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Marriage tests this power relentlessly. It asks you to stay grounded when things feel dull, to stay disciplined when motivation fades, and to stay loyal when novelty whispers alternatives. Reduced tolerance also reveals an avoidance of responsibility. Routine demands consistency. It asks you to show up without applause, to invest without immediate reward, to remain present when nothing dramatic is happening. That's uncomfortable for a mind trained on instant gratification. But Stoicism insists that growth happens precisely in these quiet stretches. Seneca wrote, "Difficulties strengthen the mind as labor does the body." When boredom appears, it's not an enemy. It's a signal inviting maturity. You don't need constant excitement to feel alive. That belief is a trap. A life, or marriage, built on stimulation alone becomes fragile. The moment stimulation drops, dissatisfaction rushes in. Stoicism offers an alternative, contentment rooted in discipline and purpose. Routine becomes meaningful when you understand why you're enduring it. Marriage is not about being entertained. It's about building something stable enough to withstand time, stress, and human imperfection. There's also a deeper psychological cost to reduced tolerance. When hardship is avoided, resilience never develops. Each challenge feels heavier than the last. You begin to believe peace should be effortless, but peace is practiced. It's trained. Didn't wait for ease, he cultivated calm in chaos. Marriage requires the same inner training. If you treat every low phase as a warning sign instead of a training ground, you'll never develop the endurance marriage demands. This is where you're called to act differently, not by forcing happiness, but by redefining success. Success in marriage isn't the absence of boredom, it's the ability to remain grounded through it. It's choosing steadiness over stimulation, principle over impulse, long-term meaning over short-term relief. Epictetus said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." If you want a marriage that lasts, you must become someone who can tolerate stillness, repetition, and discomfort without interpreting them as failure. Here's a practical exercise to build this tolerance. Each day, deliberately do one thing that feels routine or mildly uncomfortable without trying to escape it mentally. Don't rush it. Don't distract yourself. Just stay present. This trains your nervous system to stop panicking when stimulation drops. Another exercise is reflection without judgment. At the end of the day, ask yourself, did I respond to discomfort with discipline or avoidance? Write the answer honestly. This is how Stoics sharpen their character, through daily self-examination, not emotional indulgence. You can also practice reframing boredom. Instead of labeling it as emptiness, label it as stability, as peace without fireworks. Seneca wrote, "True happiness is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence upon the future." Routine gives you that chance. It removes chaos. It offers predictability, but only if you stop demanding that every moment entertain you. Marriage was never meant to be easy, and it was never meant to be exciting all the time. It was meant to be formative. It shapes patience. It reveals selfishness. It strengthens discipline. Reduced tolerance for hardship doesn't just damage marriage, it weakens character. When you learn to endure routine without resentment, you don't just save a relationship. You build inner strength that carries into every area of life. So take responsibility for your tolerance, train it, expand it. Stop mistaking discomfort for disaster. Stop equating boredom with failure. Learn to stand firm in the quiet phases. Said, the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. In this case, the injury is modern impatience. Be unlike it. Choose endurance. Choose principle. Choose depth over novelty. Marriage doesn't collapse because of hardship. It collapses when tolerance disappears. Build yours deliberately. Practice it daily. And you'll discover something most never do. What you once called boring was actually peace, waiting for you to grow into it. Number 9. Validation seeking outside the marriage, undermining loyalty and trust. There's a quiet erosion happening in modern marriage, and it doesn't begin with betrayal or dramatic exits. It begins with something far more subtle, the hunger to be seen, affirmed, admired by people who are not part of the marital bond. Validation seeking outside the marriage doesn't always look like disloyalty at first. It often disguises itself as harmless attention, innocent reassurance, or emotional relief. But Stoicism teaches you to judge actions not by how they appear, but by what they train your character to become. Warned, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. When attention drifts outward, loyalty weakens inwardly, and trust begins to thin long before it breaks. Marriage demands containment, not confinement but containment, a conscious choice to direct emotional energy inward instead of scattering it outward. When validation is repeatedly sourced from outside eyes, outside approval, outside affirmation, it signals a fracture in commitment. You may tell yourself it's nothing, that it doesn't change how you feel at home, but habits shape identity. Epictetus made this clear. No man is free who is not master of himself. If your sense of worth depends on external applause, you are no longer sovereign. And when sovereignty fades, so does fidelity. Not just physical fidelity, but emotional loyalty. Trust in marriage is built on predictability of intention. Your partner needs to know where your emotional gravity lives. When validation is sought elsewhere, even subtly, that gravity shifts. The marriage becomes one source among many instead of the anchor. Stoicism places enormous importance on loyalty to roles. Reminded himself daily that he was a son, a citizen, a leader, and that each role carried duties. Marriage is no different. It is a role that demands discipline, not just feeling. When validation is outsourced, discipline is replaced by impulse, and impulse is never a reliable guardian of trust. What makes this so destructive is not the attention itself, but the internal permission it requires. To seek validation outside the marriage, you must first tell yourself that your partner's presence is insufficient. That narrative, repeated quietly, reshapes how you show up. Seneca wrote, "He who is everywhere is nowhere." When your emotional focus is scattered, your commitment loses depth. Loyalty cannot survive diffusion. It needs concentration. It needs deliberate restraint. It needs you to say no to attention that flatters the ego but starves the bond. Stoicism does not condemn desire. It demands order. Desire without hierarchy leads to chaos. Marriage places a clear hierarchy on intimacy and affirmation. When that order is disrupted, resentment grows on both sides. Even if unspoken, the imbalance is felt. Trust erodes not because of what is proven, but because of what is sensed. Humans are remarkably sensitive to divided presence. You can feel when someone is no longer fully with you. And once that feeling sets in, repair becomes difficult. There is also a deeper psychological cost. Validation seeking trains you to measure your worth by reaction rather than by principle. That's a dangerous trade. Wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." Marriage requires that strength. It asks you to ground your self-worth internally and relationally, not socially and externally. When affirmation becomes addictive, loyalty becomes negotiable. Not because you intend harm, but because you've taught yourself that attention is oxygen. This is where responsibility matters. Stoicism is brutally honest about agency. You are not compelled to seek validation elsewhere. You choose it even if unconsciously, and every choice reinforces a pattern. The pattern eventually becomes character. The character shapes the marriage. This is not about blame, it's about causality. If you want trust, you must behave in ways that make trust rational. If you want loyalty, you must stop feeding impulses that compete with it. Now comes the corrective work. Not dramatic vows, not speeches, habits. Start by practicing validation containment. Make a daily decision to redirect the urge for external affirmation back into self-respect and marital presence. When you feel the pull to be noticed, pause, ask yourself, what am I actually seeking right now? Approval, reassurance, or escape? Numbing the desire weakens it. Epictetus taught, if you do not want to be disturbed, do not let yourself be carried away by impressions. This pause is how you regain control. Another practice is internal sufficiency training. Each day, affirm your own worth based on virtue, not attention. Write down one action you took that aligned with integrity, discipline, or loyalty. This rewires your validation source. Seneca advised nightly self-examination for this exact reason. When you validate yourself through principle, the craving for external approval loses intensity. You should also practice relational investment. Direct deliberate attention back into the marriage, not to extract validation, but to contribute stability. Stoicism emphasizes contribution over consumption. Wrote, "What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee." Validation seeking outside the marriage benefits the ego, not the union. Redirecting energy inward strengthens the structure that actually supports you long-term. Understand this clearly. Marriage does not collapse overnight. It erodes through permission slips. Permission to seek attention. Permission to feel entitled to affirmation without responsibility. Permission to prioritize feeling admired over being trustworthy. Stoicism cuts through this fog by asking one simple question. Is this within my control, and does it align with virtue? If the answer is no, restraint becomes the only rational choice. If you want to protect marriage, you must protect loyalty at the level of thought, not just action. You must guard where your attention goes, where your ego feeds, and where your sense of worth is anchored. This is not suppression. It is self-command. And self-command is the foundation of any lasting bond. So take this seriously. Audit your habits. Reduce exposure to attention that competes with commitment. Strengthen your internal validation. Practice discipline quietly. Marriage survives not because of passion alone, but because of daily, almost invisible choices that reinforce trust. Choose containment over craving. Choose loyalty over applause. Choose virtue over impulse. As the Stoics understood, a stable life is built not by indulging every desire but by mastering them. Number 10, treating marriage as an exit arrangement rather than a lifelong bond. Treating marriage as an exit arrangement rather than a lifelong bond quietly rewires the entire meaning of commitment, and you can feel the consequences long before anyone says the word divorce. When marriage is entered with one foot already near the door, it stops being a vow and starts becoming a conditional contract. Stoicism teaches you that what you prepare for internally is what you eventually create externally. Warned, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. When the dominant thought behind marriage is escape instead of endurance, the relationship absorbs that fragility. You don't build something strong while constantly rehearsing how to leave it. You live in a culture that celebrates options, not obligations. Freedom is praised, permanence is questioned, and endurance is often mistaken for weakness. But Stoicism never confused freedom with avoidance. Epictetus was clear. First learn the meaning of what you say and then speak. When marriage is treated as something you can exit the moment it feels uncomfortable, the words "for better or worse" lose their weight. Commitment becomes performative. Loyalty becomes temporary. And trust, real trust, never fully forms because both people sense that the ground beneath them is conditional. You don't protect something you believe is disposable. That's the quiet danger. When marriage becomes exit-ready, effort becomes selective, patience shortens, forgiveness becomes rare, discipline erodes. Why struggle through discomfort if you've already decided discomfort is a reason to leave? Stoicism teaches the opposite approach. Seneca wrote, "Fire tests gold, misfortune tests brave men." Marriage was never designed to be a comfort machine. It is a refinement process. When you remove endurance from the equation, you remove the very mechanism that deepens character and connection. This mindset doesn't announce itself loudly. It hides behind language like knowing your worth, keeping options open, or not settling. But Stoicism asks a sharper question. Does this belief make you more virtuous or more avoidant? A lifelong bond requires the courage to stay present when things stop being flattering. Exit-ready thinking trains you to monitor satisfaction instead of cultivate responsibility. And responsibility, not constant happiness, is what creates stability over time. Reminded himself daily, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Treating marriage as temporary hands your power over to moods, impulses, and fluctuations. You become governed by how you feel today instead of what you committed to uphold tomorrow. That doesn't create partnership. It creates negotiation fatigue. One person becomes the evaluator, the other the performer. Love cannot survive long in that dynamic. Stoicism never promised ease, it promised meaning. A lifelong bond asks you to grow instead of flee, to regulate instead of retaliate, to stay rooted instead of scanning for exits. When marriage is approached as permanent, behavior changes naturally. You invest differently, you speak differently, you resolve conflict differently. Permanence forces maturity. Temporariness encourages entitlement. That's not a moral judgment, it's a psychological law. If you sense resistance rising as you read this, pause. That resistance is worth examining. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." The modern world may call lifelong commitment outdated, risky, or naive. Stoicism calls it disciplined, courageous, deliberate. The Stoic doesn't fear commitment because the Stoic has already accepted that hardship is part of life. You don't enter marriage expecting constant ease. You enter it expecting responsibility. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When exit is always available, effort becomes optional. And optional effort breeds decay. Not all at once, slowly, quietly. Respect thins, intimacy dulls, gratitude fades. This isn't because people are cruel, it's because humans rise to the standards they set internally. If the standard is, I'll stay as long as it feels good, the moment it doesn't, disengagement feels justified. Stoicism asks you to hold a higher internal bar, regardless of external validation. Now, this doesn't mean enduring abuse or abandoning self-respect. Stoicism never advocates self-destruction. It advocates wisdom. The distinction matters. Lifelong bond does not mean blind tolerance. It means you enter marriage with the understanding that difficulty is not evidence of failure. It's evidence of life unfolding. Seneca wrote, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity." Marriage, when treated seriously, is one of the great arenas where character is tested and refined. To realign your mindset, you must train it deliberately. Start with this exercise. Write down what marriage means to you when comfort is removed from the definition. Not happiness, not excitement. Strip it down to responsibility, duty, and shared endurance. Sit with the discomfort that arises. That discomfort is where growth begins. Another practice is daily restraint. When frustration surfaces, resist the urge to mentally withdraw. Instead, practice staying present without rehearsing escape. Practice this discipline constantly, reminding himself, do not be overheard complaining, not even to yourself. You also need to examine the stories you consume. Are they feeding endurance or escape? Stoicism teaches you to guard the mind fiercely. What you normalize internally becomes what you tolerate externally. If exit is glorified, permanence feels suffocating. But when endurance is honored, commitment becomes stabilizing instead of threatening. Marriage was never meant to be an emotional emergency exit. It was meant to be a structure strong enough to hold two imperfect people through time. When that structure is weakened by exit-ready thinking, the entire institution trembles. Not because people are incapable, but because they're undertrained in endurance. Stoicism offers that training quietly and relentlessly. So take responsibility for your mindset. Decide what kind of bond you believe in before you enter one. Train yourself to stay when it's easier to leave. Discipline your thoughts before they discipline your actions. Because when marriage is treated as a lifelong bond, not an escape plan, something rare happens. Trust deepens, character strengthens, and stability becomes possible again. As said, what we do now echoes in eternity. Choose commitment with intention, not because it's easy, but because it's worthy of you. Before you click away, understand this. Marriage was never meant to survive on emotion alone. The Stoics warned us, if you are ruled by pleasure, you are not free. What you're seeing today isn't the collapse of marriage itself, but the collapse of discipline, accountability, and shared responsibility. When comfort replaces character, commitment becomes fragile. When feelings become law, vows become optional. This video wasn't made to attack, it was made to wake you up. Because if you understand why marriage is failing, you gain the power to protect yourself from repeating the same mistakes. Most men walk into marriage unprepared, hoping love will carry what structure should have built. It won't, and it never has. Remember this, you don't need to be loud, angry, or resentful. You need to be clear about your values, clear about boundaries, clear about the kind of life you are willing or unwilling to live. The man who knows this cannot be manipulated, rushed, or emotionally cornered. If this video challenged you, that's a good sign. Sit with it, reflect on it, and most importantly, apply it. Because awareness without action changes nothing. If you want more Stoic truths that sharpen your judgment, strengthen your masculinity, and protect your future, subscribe, like, and share this with a man who needs to hear it. This might be the knowledge that saves him before it's too late.